Okay, so welcome all to our Bible study on 2 Samuel chapter 11. We are going to cover the whole chapter today. It's got 27 verses, but it's mostly narrative, so it shouldn't be too difficult to cover that text. It's a very famous passage, of course, about David and Bathsheba, and it carries on into chapter 12, but we will deal with chapter 12 on its own. Excuse me, on its own next time. Let's open with prayer. Heavenly Father, you have called us to live as your children by faith in Jesus, in faithfulness, in hearing and doing your word. Open our hearts now to hear your word so that we may be doers of your word. Grow in faith, in hope and in love. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so 2 Samuel chapter 11, it begins a new section or new narrative, so it's doesn't follow directly on from the last time where we had the battles between David and the Ammonites. This comes quite some time afterwards, probably. But without further ado, shall we read it? Really, we need to read the whole thing in one go. So if I start with the first paragraph, and then we go anti-clockwise, paragraph each.
That's
Anti-clockwise is that way, yeah. And I know, Barbara, you're not keen to read, so you just we'll just pass through, and I'll go back. So I'll read the first paragraph. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem.
Happened late one afternoon when David rose from the couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house. Then he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is that this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messages and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she'd been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant."
So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing, and how the people fared, and how the war prospered. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." And Uriah went out of the king's house, and they followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "Have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will let you depart." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. And David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house.
In the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, that he may be struck down and die." And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, and he instructed the messenger, "When you have finished telling all the news about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger rises and if he says to you, 'Why did you go so near to the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebes? Why did you go so near the wall?' Then you shall say, 'Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also.'"
So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had said to him. The messenger said to David, "The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also." David said to the messenger, "Thus shall you say to Joab, 'Do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him.'" When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah her husband was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and became his wife, and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord.
Thank you very much for the reading. As I said, the story is well known to most people who know their Bibles, their Bible stories, and I'm sure it's familiar to you.
Yeah.
And there are all sorts of details that we will be looking at as we go along. But before we do, are there any sort of initial questions or comments about any of this?
Well, I've always thought on this that David is supposed to be the Lord's chosen king, and then he does something that's so terrible that it shouldn't have ever happened. This is all, he's thought about it, he's worked it out, he's made it so he gets the woman, and has found a way to get rid of the husband. So it's all
He's put himself first, really, hasn't he, rather than obeying the Lord?
Yes.
Yes, but he's still the chosen king, so...
Yes, because he was chosen king before.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how come this last bit, displeased, so by the Lord? So where does that, who puts that down there at the bottom? Is it somebody who feels that that's what needs to be put down? Because I don't think that David would put it down himself.
This was not written by David. None of this was written by David.
But I just, who would have written that, do you think?
I don't know who. We don't know who wrote this. It was simply whoever the author is.
Right.
The author of this book is unknown to us.
Right.
Yeah, there's a thing about this word displeased. It sounds very mild when you think of what has happened. And then another thing about this Bathsheba, that usually the time of mourning of somebody's husband is more than just one day. So it's quite amazing.
Say that again. Second bit. Say that again.
That when it tells that Bathsheba was when she heard that her husband was dead, she only waited for one day and then went to David. Isn't that the time for lamenting on somebody's husband much longer?
It's not one day. It doesn't actually say how long it was. We'll talk about that when we come to just as time of mourning.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, that's verse 27. But yes, he was quite quick. Yes.
Well, she was pregnant anyway, so I suppose he wanted to marry her as soon as possible.
We'll come to that. Yes, we'll look at that, the whole thing. Yeah.
I don't think I have any time in mind.
It just is time of mourning. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's have a look then at this in more detail. So we'll go back to the beginning. So it starts with the spring of the year. Literally means the turn of the year, but that refers to spring. The time when kings go out to battle. We have this a few times in the Old Testament. This time when kings go to, it says this is the fighting season, and that means after winter. Winter is rainy and muddy and so on, so it's not a good time. I mean, this sounds terribly old-fashioned and terrible, but actually, you will remember the evacuation of Western troops from Afghanistan only last year,
Yes.
and the terrible chaos that caused and the huge suffering. And one of the many things that was criticized, the American military and political leadership who were in charge of the timing, one of the things we were criticized for was the timing. They withdrew in the middle of the fighting season, which meant that the Taliban were out in full force. And whereas if they'd done that in January, when the mountains and the valleys are filled with snow and it's very, very difficult to get about, it would be much, much easier because it's not the fighting season. Now, of course, in many parts of the world these days with modern technology, these things aren't really relevant anymore, but they were until recently, and they're still parts of the world where you just don't want to be. I mean, enough people have discovered now that, for example, if you're going to invade Russia, make sure that the job's done by the time the winter comes, because otherwise they won't be done, and so on. So this is reference to the time when kings are out to battle. It's the time, if there's any ongoing conflict or battle, it would have stopped for the winter, and now it resumes in the spring. And of course, we have just heard in the previous chapter that David has been at war with Ammon, and we know from the summary of David's battles beforehand that these battles with the Ammonites did not come to an end until later on. Until David finally defeats Hadadezer and takes over, if you like, takes control of that region. And so this is the ongoing war and conflict with the Ammonites, which now resumes in the spring. So that's just a very technical fact. But note what it says. Spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab. It's the time when kings go to battle, and the king did not go to battle. He sent Joab and his servants with him, and all Israel. So everybody went except David, even though it was actually his primary calling. One of his primary callings was to lead the armies of Israel, to be their leader. I mean, later on, when David is a little bit older, there is a time when his military commanders implore him to stay in Jerusalem, not come, so that he does not risk his life, which possibly has to do with the fact that he's not quite as able and agile a warrior anymore as he once was. Be that as it may, there is no indication here that this is the case. He has decided to stay at home. Now, they were successful. They had ravaged the Ammonites, besieged Rabbah, and look at these emphatic, but David remained in Jerusalem.
But we know why, don't we? I mean, he's obviously watched this lady for some time.
No, we haven't. We're no indication that he has. You're speculating that he is, but no, I doubt that is the reason. Actually, even if he has, that's not given as the reason. I think more of the key point, and we'll also talk about it at the end again. But David had a calling from God, had a very clear calling, and what he does here is that he neglects his calling. He doesn't follow the call that he has, his vocation from God, which is to lead Israel. He stays at home, he becomes idle, and all of a sudden, he's got all this time. Look at verse 2. It happened late one afternoon, or that might mean evening, it's kind of early evening, late afternoon, around sunset, when David arose from his couch.
His bed, I thought.
He didn't get up very early.
Well, it doesn't mean that he's necessarily. It's probably not the bed in which he.
Not very busy.
He's just loafing around, lying around, being idle. And there are sayings about idle hands and so on. There's a reason why you need to keep people busy, why you need to stay busy. And you see, David had plenty to do. He'd been given this calling, and what he does instead is decides to delegate the things that are his to other people to do, and he finds himself idle. The moment he finds himself idle, he makes himself vulnerable to temptation. There are lots of really good reasons why all people ought to keep busy. I don't mean that you have to be busy in the kind of rush to your feet sort of way, but the opposite of idle. Keep purposefully engaged with things that keep you occupied.
And the fact, and the fact is underlined when Uriah tells that he is not even go home because he's thinking of his men in the battle, and now the king was just on the couch.
Yes, yeah, and we'll draw the contrast between David and Uriah more strongly as well as we go along. But the point is that, of course, here's that because he is not, he's got plenty to do, he doesn't do it, and now he's vulnerable to temptation because he shouldn't be. I mean, he shouldn't have time to be doing this sort of thing. Plus, I mean, there's of course the other thing, of course, that he has another vocation other than leading the armies of Israel, and the other vocation that he is a husband.
Yes.
If he's lonely or needs some company, he's got choice. He hasn't got just one wife; he's got several.
Mhm.
And this is something very, very important about vocation. We all have a vocation. We all have got different roles that we have, and one of the most important things we can do, for our well-being, and as we will see, for the well-being of those around us, is to be careful to find out what our vocation is and then act accordingly. So that if we are called to serve, then we serve, and we serve diligently, and we find ourselves, and we find that I have time to lie on my couch until evening and then go for a pleasant walk.
Oh, I thought you did that every day.
Well, if that is the case, then what you will say, hang on, why am I allocating my time thus? What could I be doing? How can I be serving? So that there isn't that opportunity that idleness creates for temptation to set in. I mean, have you ever noticed when you set yourself to some task that really consumes your attention, that the hours fly by because you just because all of a sudden the world outside you've got to focus. And focus is really important. There's a little footnote here that there's a lot of talk about
What's going down Oz.
there's a lot of talk about multitasking. There's some people, and the answer ask any neuroscientist, they will tell you there's not a person in the world who can multitask. You might be able to switch your attention very quickly, but you can multitasking. If you ever try to write a letter while holding a conversation with the person in the room, you will find
not that sort of multitasking.
That is
doing things and talking. Sometimes it's possible.
Yeah, but what I mean, what was meant by multitasking is that you occupy your mind with one task and another task at the same time, and that's not really possible. So your brain is, generally speaking, able to. I mean, there are some background things you can do, but there are the other things. I mean, I find, for example, that if I'm playing the piano, I can't talk. There are other people who can. I mean, I can't. If you talk to me, I try to talk. I can't speak.
You'd be able to sing at the piano, though.
But that's not. I'm talking about something else.
Oh.
Okay, so because those are two things working together. If I'm trying to do things and do something else, but all the same. So what we need to do is we need to. If we're doing something, it requires our concentration, it requires our focus, it requires our attention. When our attention is on something that God has called us to do, that puts us in a place of safety. Because if God calls us to something, He also then takes responsibility for it. Whereas if we excuse ourselves from our God-given responsibilities and find ourselves doing nothing at all but pleasing ourselves, well, if we go about pleasing ourselves, well, that doesn't usually end well. So that's not what we weren't created to please ourselves. We were created to please God and to please our neighbours. And that way we also find contentment and happiness, because this does not end well for anybody. This doesn't end well for David or for Bathsheba or anybody around them. Everybody suffers, David included, even though he's a pope. So this is a really powerful and important lesson about our vocation. And if you have got nothing to do, and you find that you're just lying on the sofa, waiting for the evening so you can go for a walk and then go back to bed,
Find something to do.
Then you will find that if there's nothing better to do, I mean, it's like my grandmother used to do. She used to she had terrible problems with insomnia, and she would lie in bed for hours and hours at night. And you can't go and at 3 a.m. So what did she do? She took out her prayer list and she prayed. She prayed for her family and her friends and the country, all the things. And she spent that time praying, and that's where her attention went. She turned her suffering into an opportunity then to serve in that way. And there's always a Bible you can open it. So this is what David's doing. So we see kind of the author kind of whoever wrote this puts out these little clues that He stayed at home. He sent Joab. He remained at Jerusalem, and he's on his bed couch in the day, and then he got up in the evening. A very long siesta, if you like. And he went and walked on the roof of the king's house, which is he was in very often in warm. It's the cool place. It's the place where there's breeze and things, whereas the house might it's baked by the sun all day, so it's quite warm outside. He wants a cool place. He goes on the roof, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. Now this very beautiful. There's only one other person in the whole Old Testament that's referred to as very beautiful, and that's Rebecca. There are some other people. I mean, we are told that Saul was handsome. We're told that David was handsome. We find out later on that not only Bathsheba but also David's daughter is beautiful. One of David's sons, Absalom, is described as being beautiful in appearance. So they're always, but Bathsheba is described as being very beautiful. Now, from the circumstances and from other kind of incidental information here, we can be fairly certain that she was young, because she was married but is apparently childless. So the chances are, and as we discover, she was not infertile. So the chances are that she was quite newly married. She hadn't yet born a child. So in all likelihood, she was quite possibly in her late teens or maybe early 20s. And of course, that is the time when women are at their most attractive and their most fertile. And those two things go together. You take almost, if you do an anonymous survey of honest men of almost any age, and you show them pictures of women of different ages, they will all pick, regardless of their age, the most attractive being between the ages of 18 and 25. And so, if Bathsheba was a beauty, she was at the peak of her beauty, almost certainly because she was at that age, just having reached adulthood, and so on, and not yet having children and so on. And she was bathing, which implies that she wasn't wearing very much. No. It doesn't mean that she was necessarily completely naked, but that she was nevertheless in a state of sufficient undress to draw David's attention. And what should he have done?
Should have turned around and gone away.
Thank you. Yeah, gone down and come back later on when she's finished. And her beauty awakes in him lust. And for reasons that are not explained, but which are very commonly observed in the world, he gives way to lust. Instead of fighting the urge, he decides to act on it. And this is the first time that we see the corruption of power in David. Because if David had been a shepherd boy and spotting a young woman, beautiful young woman washing, he could barely have sent somebody to fetch her. But now he has both the motive, which is his lust, and the opportunity, which is his authority and power as king. And he takes that power that God had given to him to be the shepherd of Israel, to be the protector of the flock, to protect the sheep of God's flock, if you like. And he decides to use that power instead to act against them, to please himself.
There's a doctor once said that a good remedy in this kind of a situation would be that because you might not be able to resist the feel that you have when you see something like this, but then you go to your own wife.
Yes. Yeah. And this is one reason why. This is one of the chief reasons we're told that after the fall, according to St. Paul, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, is why marriage was given, so that people may not burn it with lust, so that they may remain chaste. The natural urges of people are natural urges; they're God created, but in a sinful nature, combined with sinful nature, they become powerful and damaging unless they're held under control. And in order for them to be controlled, most people do not have, especially younger people, do not have the gift of God. Some do, but most don't. And so God gave marriage for that purpose. One of the I think, one of the very unwise developments in our culture currently, but it's been observed in many other cultures in different forms, is the delay of marriage. And people say you can't possibly, for example, wait, to wait for sexual relations until your marriage. Well, no. If people start going out when they're 19 and get married when they're 31, it will be quite tricky. One reason why in so many cultures there was widespread prostitution was that although women often married quite young, men did not. So men might wait till 30 to marry a woman much younger than himself, and that's a very long time for a young man to keep himself pure and continent and chaste. And so the answer to that problem, as it were, was prostitution. But the God-given answer, of course, is marriage. If you can't wait, get married. And if you can't afford a big wedding, have a little one. If you need to have a big party, wait till you can afford that one, but get married. And David, of course, was married more than one. He had several wives. And of course, one of the other things, and maybe doesn't apply to so much to the present company, but if there are others either listening in or will be listening later, is that we have to. One of the things that I think, particularly in our visual age, when we have so many things that we see, screens, TVs or computers, cinema, is that the image is very powerful, and powerful images tend to remain with us. And once you see something, you cannot unsee it. And therefore, it's very important that we protect ourselves from seeing things that we ought not to see, whether it is, like in David's case, somebody else's wife in a state of undress, whether it's scenes of violence or things like that, because they change us. And once it's been seen once, you can't go backwards and say, okay, let's undo this and have a different experience. And so David is unwise in all kinds of different ways in this, and so it's very, very important for us to note that. Now, notice that she is referred to as a woman in verse 2 twice. Verse 3, David sent and inquired about the woman, and then from there onwards, from verse 4 onwards, she's referred to as her and she and her, and verse 5, she is the woman. All of these very impersonal references to her. She's not a person, she's a female, unnamed female as far as David is concerned, and she's treated in that kind of referred to in that very, very impersonal way. David isn't concerned about her as a person. David is simply attracted by her beauty, and she's just the beautiful woman. Compare the description when she's referred to by others. So her name is given in verse 3, Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah. She's somebody's daughter and somebody's wife. And then Uriah refers to her as, in verse 11, as his wife. And at verse 26, at the very end, we're told that she's referred to as the wife of Uriah. That Uriah, her husband, was dead. She lamented over her husband. So when the perspective is on Bathsheba and Uriah, she is Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, Eliam's daughter. When the story is looking from David's perspective, it's just that woman. It's a little bit like, well, not a little bit, an awful lot like, in the 90s, you might remember the scandal about Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky.
Oh, yes.
And he was the most powerful man in the world, and she was a young woman under his eye, or and not bathing in public, but nevertheless under that. And they had, and when he was being interrogated about it in the judicial process, he said in a famous outburst that I did not have sexual relations with that woman, which wasn't only a lie, but it described, it revealed his contempt for her as a person, that woman.
Mm.
And we see this very same thing. And what we see here is a massive power imbalance. You've got the king, and you've got this young woman. And he sends for her. So he sees her and says, I want to find out who that is. Inquires about her. So he pursues his lust, decides to act upon it, finds out who she is, and then sent messages and took her by them. In other words, messengers, so knock, knock, knock. We are messengers from the palace. King David wants to, has summoned you. What do? You go.
Go to the king, yeah.
And she went, came to him, and he lay with her. And he says he doesn't say that they lay together, he lay with her. Now there's been debate as to who's at fault here. And I have heard many attempts to say actually maybe it was Bathsheba's fault really. What was she doing bathing in public like that? He wouldn't have seen her, and she must have clearly positioned herself such that he could see her and kind of essentially seduced him. There's absolutely no indication here whatsoever, and we know why she was bathing. She wasn't bathing to be noticed. And even if she had been willing, which I would argue is irrelevant at this point, the fact that he's the king and she is just the subject of the king means that the power imbalance is such that, to use modern legal terminology, there is no way that she could have, to use that to kind of modern jargon, given her consent freely. Even if she didn't fight again, even if she said, okay, here we go, there's nothing I can do about this. There's been a case in the news, a very prominent, quite a well-known footballer, Premiership, top level footballer who's been in court for multiple accounts of rape. And the reporting has revealed that the same pattern. So these women who've been giving testimony saying basically they ended up in his hotel room one for another, and then he initiated sexual relations, and they kind of thought after, well, they could get out anyway and say, okay, well, I'll go along with it, that is that way I can go. But it wasn't, so they didn't say no and scream as they, stop raping me, but they felt that they had no option, they had no choice. And that, not only in modern UK law, but in any kind of system of, any reasonable sort of deliberation of the matter, consists coercion, even if it doesn't, it's different from a man with a knife in the alley. Nevertheless, it's not a free relationship, and there are many, like there are some jurisdictions in certain parts of the world where, for example, any kind of sexual relationship that is not legalized, i.e. not marital, between a superior and an underling is treated as sexual abuse by default, even if the underling doesn't necessarily protest. If the boss sleeps with the secretary, that's considered sexual abuse because of the power imbalance.
It's the same, is it not, with teachers or professors with pupils who are young women?
Yes.
17, if they're under the age of consent,
but
that's the power.
Yes, it is. But even if they are adults in something like, there are some states in the
But it's the status, isn't it?
Yes,
that
exactly.
one is holding against the other.
Yes. So if you are a cleaner in a firm and the CEO express an interest in you, you are at a massive disadvantage because it takes a huge amount of courage to say no to your the person on whom your livelihood depends and who has all the power. This is one reason why unmarried clergy are always instructed to tread very, very carefully in relationships with their parishioners. I mean, the advice generally given is that if you want to, for example, if a pastor wants to start dating a single lady in his congregation, that she should move to another congregation so as to create a space, which in a church like ours can be tricky, given the distances involved. But these are all to do with this fact. So even if, there is absolutely no hint in the text that Bathsheba is in any way liable or is actively participant. Even if she were, that does not excuse David at all, because he's the king. He's supposed to uphold the law. He's supposed to be there to protect her. from harm and danger. God had given His law to protect the rights and freedom of Israel, including the safety and chastity of marriage. And there's a sixth one, the whole commandment, 1 out of 10 commandments. You shall not commit adultery. They are both married, and He's supposed to uphold them.
And then there's another interesting thing where one of the law which Moses gave to the Israelites was that if a woman is not screaming for help, then she's the guilty one. But here, how would you scream when it's a king?
Yeah, and it's not even that she's a guilty one, but that she's equal, that she's compliant, if you like. Yeah, so it doesn't mean that she's guilty as opposed to him, but she's complicit in the crime. But of course, yeah, here there is no opportunity for it. And that law specifically relates to rape, if you like, out in the field. But if you're in somebody's house, and she has, I mean, I've made the point about it. She doesn't have a chance once David sets his eyes on her, and he knows who she is. She's got a name, the daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite. Now, there's one Eliam mentioned in the Bible. That's later on in this book, chapter 23. There's an Eliam who's one of David had in his. There was the 30 men, the kind of the creme de la creme of his kind of top soldiers. There are 30 men, and they include Uriah, was one of the 30. They include an Eliam. Now, we don't know if this is the same Eliam, but it's the only other Eliam we know of. So it may well be. So in fact, the Uriah and Eliam are colleagues in the army, and Uriah has married his colleague's daughter. So these are David's most trusted men. So it's not just that he's dealing with some random man's wife, but these are his kind of the royal guard, the crack troops who are closest to him in matters military. And so this is, he's kind of getting into an almighty mess here in all kinds of ways. Now, Uriah is described as Uriah the Hittite. A little footnote for you about confidence in the Bible. Until not that long ago, the only reference to any Hittites was in the Bible. The Bible referred to the Hittites, and when people began to question the reliability of the Bible, say, well, the Bible speaks of these Hittites, but there's no trace of any Hittites in the Middle East. Did they even exist? And of course, in the 19th century, archaeology really took off. They soon enough found that there had been a Hittite empire in Anatolia and Turkey, which spread in the second millennium. And then people said, oh, well, yes, okay, fine, but there is no archaeological evidence whatsoever that there were any Hittites in Israel in David's time. Which is basically saying, according to what we have discovered so far, there is no evidence that there were enough Hittites in David's time in Israel to have left behind archaeological remains. All it took was for Uriah's family to have traveled through there or been there, and one of them said, actually, I'm going to stay here. I'll marry the local girl and stay here. And they won't have left any remains, but and we know he's got a Hebrew name, Uriah, which means the Lord Yahweh is my light. It's a beautiful name. Yahweh is my light. So, they had Uriah and his family, and probably in previous generations, had in fact joined Israel, had become, had started to believe and follow the God of Israel. And he's known as Uriah the Hittite because there were no surnames. So how do you if there are two Uriahs, well, he's the one who's the Hittite. And it doesn't, all it means is that they know that that's the background of his family. And so, yeah, we can be confident that the more archaeologists have dug up the Holy Land and the Middle East, the more they find corroboration, not less. Now we are told that in verse 4 that Bathsheba, the reason why she was having this bath was that she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness.
Mm.
In other words, she had just come to the end of her period,
Oh,
which would render you ritually unclean.
yeah.
And according to the law of Moses, when you menstruated, you needed to purify yourself, which meant a washing. That would take place in the evening of the end of the menstruation, so, at the end of the day, because when the day begins at sunset. So when you get to just before sunset is the end of the day. So once you finish menstruating, at the end of that day, you wash yourself, and you are therefore not just physically clean, but then it's a kind of ritual purification. You wash your whole body, and now you are clean, so that when the next day begins, you are now clean. You're no longer unclean or defiled. Now this tells us, and we see more of this, that Uriah's household was an observant household. They were not just nominal Israelites. They observed the law. Bathsheba observed the law. On this, what you might say like a second tier law. I mean, it's not a second tier in the sense that all law is given by God, but it's not one of the 10 Commandments. Put it that way. Meanwhile, David has just, so David has just broken the 6th commandment, you shall not commit adultery, and forced Bathsheba to join, while she had been fastidiously keeping the lesser law of purification after menstruation. So that puts puts Uriah and Bathsheba in a very much better light than David. And it also tells us, obviously, that if she has just finished menstruating, then the chances of becoming pregnant are very high after menstruation. She's about to, the next stage, as you know, is ovulation. And it also confirmed beyond any doubt that this was not Uriah's child. She can't have been pregnant before, and just, David thought that, let's basically, she had just finished menstruating, so she was not pregnant when this thing started. And so he defiled her while she had been while she was in the process of cleansing herself.
So could we think that that's why he sent her husband away? Because he knew what was happening.
That's exactly what's happening. Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not like the first time he's seen her. In actual fact.
Oh, no. Oh, I see that he sent her husband away so that, no, because we know these people do not appear in a story until now. And he's not been sent as such. He's a member of the army. The army's gone. And the army's gone because there's this ongoing war with Ammon. So it happens.
But that's why he stayed home.
And no, I really don't think that's the case. I know you suggested that earlier, but there's let's say there's absolutely no evidence for that. The way the story is told,
It don't seem to be
that. Well, actually, we got evidence that is not the case because verse 3, he doesn't know who she is.
Yeah.
And given that Uriah, there are all sorts of things that we can infer from this, not with absolute certainty, but with some certainty. So he doesn't know who she is. If he'd been plotting to stay behind in order to sleep with Uriah's wife, I think he would have known her by now, would have recognized her by now, given that Uriah was not some stranger somewhere, but this is a small town. Jerusalem at this point is just a large village, and Uriah is a very prominent member of his army. But it does suggest to us that they must be very recently married, because otherwise David may well have by now met her, at least known who she was, given that Uriah is not an unprominent member of the army. It tells us something about Uriah as well, if that is the case. It's not speculation, it's inference that they were recently married. The law of Moses, Deuteronomy, specifically permits men who have recently married to stay at home and not go to war. And Uriah has decided not to take use of his right to stay at home, and instead has gone to war in order to serve Israel. And when he comes home, And again, if he's a newly married husband, and King says, go back to your wife for the night. There are a lot of newly married husbands who say, yes, please. And he says, no, I've got more important business. And so if I'm right, I mean, if that is the case, then it makes Uriah to seem even more self-controlled and a man of integrity than he already comes across in the explicit part of the text, whereas David comes across as somebody who has lost their self-control and is acting according to impulse. She returned to her house, because what else could she do? But she conceived and told David, I am pregnant. Now we know, therefore, that a month has passed.
Or at least.
Yeah, minimum for 4 weeks roughly. The average menstrual cycle is around 28 days, I'm told. So whatever her cycle was, she passed that and then came to the conclusion she's pregnant. And now David's got an issue because Uriah knew, and everybody knew that she had been. And of course, he could have done something even worse, which is completely disown any knowledge of this and leave her on her own.
To anybody.
Except that there were witnesses, he had sent messengers. So he couldn't just say, oh, on me go. And now he's got this, what am I going to do? And of course, what's the right thing to do?
Get rid of the husband.
No, it's not. That's the wrong thing to do. What's the right thing to do?
Own up to it, I would have thought.
Confess your sins and then go with it. See how it goes. Well, it's the right thing to do is very often not the easy thing to do.
No, it's not.
This is why do people tell lies? Because it's often easier to tell lies than to admit the truth.
It's not easy to keep remembering what lie you've told.
Well, this is it. You have to have, it's a lie. It's true. Liars need a good memory, they say, because you have to hold them all together. And when people do lie, they usually get caught in the end because they just lose track of their own lies. It's very often the easiest thing to do is just to try and avoid responsibility in the long run, but it's a short run, but in the long run, it will come back to bite you. And even if it doesn't, there's no lying to God.
No, you'd have to go account for it.
And so David, all of a sudden, is no longer idle. He springs to action. All his cunning and his skill comes to the fore, and he sends word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. So Joab sent Uriah to David. And when Uriah came to him, remember Uriah is one of the valiant men. He's one of the top crack troops. He's like, he's like sending to the general, send me a colonel. And he starts asking sort of questions that you'd expect, that you just need a messenger boy. How's Joab and how are the people and how's the war going? So you take one of your best fighters to the front line just to answer these very simple questions. And then David says, go down to your house and wash your feet, i.e. settle down for the night. Wash your feet means you're settling for a bit. Go and lie on your couch. And Uriah went out, and there followed him a present from the king. So whether he sent food and wine or something like that, but David's trying to get him to settle down, make him comfortable, because of course what he wants is for Uriah to sleep with his wife, get her pregnant, or make him think that he's got her pregnant and cover his tracks. But Uriah instead slept basically in the porch of the king's house. It says on the step of his king's house. With the servants of his lord. Doesn't mean actually on the doorstep. That's not what it, but it means in the kind of wherever the servant slept. And didn't go to his house. And so this is the evening. So day one. And then when David hears of it, why don't you go down to your house? You've been on a long journey. Go home. Because we know that it's not a long walk home. It's near enough for David to see into the back garden from his roof. Listen to Uriah's justification. Ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, i.e. tents. And my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. So the ark, God's presence, is in a tent. The armies are in the tent of Israel and Judah. Joab, my superior, and the other servants of the king camping in the open field. So who am I to go to my house and have basically eat and drink? He's refusing leave. These basically, King David said, have a break, so take a couple of days off. And he said, how can I? I'm on call, I'm in duty. I can't do this when they are doing this. He's not looking to his own comfort, he's looking to his duty, his responsibility. Shall I then go to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? So, Uriah's probably figured out what the context is. Not why David's saying this, but that's the kind of thing. Go, sleep, go back to your own bed where your wife's waiting for you.
But he's got more wives, hasn't he?
Who? David does, but Uriah, as far as we know, Uriah doesn't.
So if he doesn't, one has to wonder what's going on here. If this is one woman he's got, who we know is a very nice lady, and he's not even going to go and see her. Does that mean there's something wrong with him?
No, the point of it is the reason he doesn't go. He says, look, I'm in the middle of, I'm on call, I'm at work, I'm a soldier, I'm fighting the king's wars. I'm not going to go and kind of visit my wife and make myself comfortable. He's just waiting to get back to the front, because he's basically putting his current duty is to his calling as he's in the middle of a battle. There's a siege going on, and he's part of it, and so he's putting that duty before his personal comfort.
I still think that there's some problem there. He's got a woman who's waiting for him,
but she's not waiting for him, because she's sent him to. He's gone to war. She's not expecting him.
He's come back, hasn't he?
Yes, but he's basically saying, I don't want to be back. I want to be back in the front. So I'm going to stay here with you other servants. I'm going to go straight back. You might think that is odd.
I think he's very odd.
But the important...
I think even if he just was like 10 minutes gone off somewhere, I think, why, and he can go back to his men after.
His conscience won't let him hurt his men.
You might think it's odd, but Barbara, the point is that you might think it's odd, but the Bible doesn't. Yeah, the Bible doesn't. It's not portrayed in the Bible at all as being an odd thing to do. It's portrayed as being an honourable thing to do. He's a man of honour. He's got a calling on. The idea of going home to his wife, having dinner with his wife, sleeping with her, whatever. That would, as far as he's concerned, and the Bible seems to agree with it, would be a dereliction of his current duty. And there's a contrast between David, who's basically saying, "What would be nice for me? I'd like to spend a few moments with that lady. That'd be nice for me." Uriah's question is, what am I supposed to be doing? Not what would be nice.
And he wouldn't do that because of his troops and
they're all in the field, and
it's only going to be 10 minutes, and he can go back to his people. But that's what I'm trying to say.
Yes, he was being told to stay the night.
Yeah, he's basically, David wants to go, have dinner with his wife and spend the night, and he's not going to. You might find it odd, as I said, but the Bible doesn't. So it's, in that sense, it's a red herring, I'm afraid. But
okay, well,
it doesn't. Within this text, it doesn't tell us anything about the relationship that he has with his wife. It just tells us about the contrast. Isn't the focus of this text is on you have a calling. What do you do with it? And Uriah says, my current calling is to be out with my men, out with my superiors, and with my troops out there, and I'm not going to give myself privileges that they don't get to enjoy. Even the ark is in a tent, so I'm not going to go home. It's a sort of what they call leading from the front.
He's more concerned about his troops and how
and about fairness to them. And so that's his thing. Once the battle's over, there's plenty of time to go home, and once we all go back to wives, I'll go to my wife. That kind of thing. So why should I take privileges for me when David has overreached? He's got loads of privileges, overreached, and used his privilege to take something that belongs to another. And so there he was. And so he swears on the life of the king. As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. I'd rather you die first than I do this. He's pretty adamant. So David then said to Uriah, hey, you stay here another day, today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So this is still, so the next day is, once the sun sets and rises again. And so he stays in Jerusalem because the king tells him to. He's under orders from king, stay here, and he gets invited to dinner, verse 13, and the king gets him drunk, thinking, okay, well, I know how to bring it. So he gets him to sin in that way in order to break down his resolve. And he quite rightly calculates that when people get drunk, their self-control goes. So remember, don't get drunk. And in the evening, he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of the Lord, but he did not go down to his house. Not even when he was drunk did he break that his resolve. He had sworn an oath that he wouldn't do it. And so David goes to plan C rather. And he wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. He sent the letter of condemnation by the hand of the condemned, who didn't know. Pretty, is a striking contrast, pretty despicable. And he says, set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die, executing by the hand of the enemy. Now, this is not a brilliant plan, and Joab, who frequently listens to what David says and then does what he thinks is actually best, also at this point doesn't actually obey to the letter. As Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men, again, crack troops, on the other side. So this is the hardest fighting. So he sent Uriah not to the weakest point, but the strongest point of defense. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. Either he sent them to the hardest place, and funny enough, the people who were sent to the hardest place
Didn't come back.
didn't come back. They died. So instead of sending them around the back, he sent them like machine guns.
Sure.
Well, that's it. That's the version, the modern day version. So why would Joab do this? Joab was actually covering for David as well as for him. Because if he had actually gone there and then told everybody, so when I make this sign, everybody withdraw and Odin tells Uriah. And then they withdraw, and Uriah's all of a sudden left alone in the middle of the enemy, gets hacked down in front of everyone. It becomes pretty obvious. It's pretty difficult to conceal that. So it's a hasty and ill-conceived plan. And then, of course, you think, well, if that happens to Uriah, who's one of the valiant men, he's one of the strong men, if the king's willing to do that and sacrifice him in that way, when's my turn going to be? Nobody knows why Uriah's being. I mean, Uriah's done nothing wrong. So if Uriah got in, it would have been an even greater catastrophe than it already was if Joab had actually done what David said. But of course, who paid for this change of plan?
Uriah and his investors.
The other men. So instead of Uriah dying, Uriah and other men died.
Yeah.
So now the rot spread. So Joab is now trying to save David's skin from his poorly executed plan. And the price for that is paid by the lives of yet others. We don't know their names, but they also had fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters and quite possibly wives and children. And they all died so that David's plan would be good enough, better than his own. So you can see the sin is just, the poisonous is spreading and spreading. And so then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, presumably not by sending yet another one of the valiant men, but just a messenger. And he told the messenger, when you finish telling the king, and if his anger arises, why did you do that? That's not what I told you to do. And then refers to the story of Abimelech. And this is from Judges chapter 9. Abimelech was the son of Gideon, who was also known as Jerubbaal, who is here referred to as Jerubbesheth. We saw this once earlier in 1 Samuel, where Jerubbaal meant he who contends with Baal, because Gideon destroyed the altar of Baal. So he's given this nickname, the one who contends with Baal. Because Baal is the name, kind of the generic name for the false god of the Canaanites. And so he's here referred to as Jerubbesheth. Besheth means shame. So it's like it's a bit like actors refuse to talk about Macbeth. They refer to the Scottish play in order not to bring about bad luck. Or in Harry Potter, there's the one who must not be named. the one who must not be named. And it's a kind of, we're not even going to say Baal, we're just going to say Jerubesheth. But yes, Abimelech, and what happened was that he was besieging a city, and a woman threw down a millstone which landed on his head and cracked his skull, and he then asked his men to put him out of his misery so that it wouldn't be said that he was killed by a woman. And yet here he is, And so they kind of have this story clearly is someone that has real resonance. Nobody wants to be like Abimelech, who was killed by a woman with a millstone. Don't you remember? And
Who was the woman? We don't know.
no, just a woman from the town. But, and then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. I.e., David will know the point. This is how I got rid of Uriah. And so messenger went and told David all that Joab sent to him to tell, and listen to David's words. Verse 23. 23 is his message, and he gives a kind of blow by blow of what happened. The archer shot at your servants from the wall. Some of your king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah is dead also. And then verse 25, David says, say to David, don't worry about it. Stuff happens. My words. But do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen against the attacking a city and never overthrow, and encourage him. Never mind, this happens. People die. It's a war. What does that sound to you like?
Well, from what we understand from this guy, he's a good guy, and even if he wanted to put someone else in front, should have made sure that this good chap is going to be there.
But so what does it tell us about David that he speaks in this way about Uriah's death?
I see.
Never mind. People die. It's a
Not
war.
caring about it really. It's just one of those things.
He's just pleased that Uriah's dead and said, "Oh well."
Shrugging it off really.
He is. Yeah. He doesn't have any care. And this is what's his job? Shepherd of Israel. Oh well,
But that's what I meant actually. That he throws in this guy who seems to be the best person there.
Well, in this particular chapter, he is the one person who acts with utter integrity. He's the one who's good, and David has thrown him to the wolves in order to cover his own sin, and other people have died as a consequence. And David is
how he thought he would get away with that, really, because the fact would still remain that Uriah had not gone home to sleep with his wife and stay at home.
Oh, but he's not the end of the story yet, you see, because then what happens is, wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, and all of a sudden, she becomes the wife of Uriah.
Oh, of course, yes.
And Uriah, her husband, was dead, and she lamented over her husband. So if you had any worries about the relationship with Uriah and Bathsheba, he was good enough that she lamented. It was a period of mourning. And then David, waited as long as he was decent. And we might have been no longer than 10 days in the period of mourning.
Really?
And then David says, okay, I'll marry you now, and made.
Mind you, then again, she might not have had necessarily a choice in that.
No.
See what I'm saying.
Very unlikely. Very unlikely. And if, again, we are not given any of this detail, but if it's true that Eliam was Uriah's colleague, and the king says to Bathsheba's father, saying, look, your poor daughter's been widowed, she's so young. Tell you what, I'll take her as my wife. Like, oh, that's very kind of you, king. Make my daughter a queen. What a gracious thing to do for a poor young widow, widow of 20 or whatever, and it makes him look good. And then she bears him a son. And okay, we know that this wasn't a full 40 weeks, but it was near enough that you get away with it. Give or take a month. Baby is born at 37 weeks, no problem. Or 36 weeks, usually it was always fine, and it all looks. People might have looked at it. That was quick, but so it looks like he has covered his tracks. It's interesting how in the New Testament this is not covered up. The Gospel of Matthew begins with the genealogy of Jesus, and it goes like this: I won't read the whole thing, but the beginning. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, the prostitute, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. So David's sin is still
running through,
written into the New Testament,
Mm.
into the genealogy. So what we remember, the rule number one when things go wrong in the world is that God doesn't only use the good things, but He can also use bad things to bring about His purposes.
Yeah, but
And so
Solomon wasn't a bad thing, was he?
We'll
Did
come
he?
to Solomon later on. But the fact that David had children, any children were Bathsheba, that was a bad thing.
Mm.
She was the wife of Uriah,
Mm.
and but she can, we have Rahab here, who is a prostitute. God doesn't think prostitution is not good, and prostitutes don't become prostitutes because they are immoral people who enjoy sex. People become prostitutes usually out of desperation or coercion. Those are the things. People don't, Boaz married Ruth, but he only married Ruth because she had become widowed. And she had become widowed, as was, all the men in the family died. 3 husbands all died. And she would have been young as well because she was still childless when she was widowed. That wasn't a good thing. So into the very genealogy of Jesus are written disasters for women, which God then turned into such things that they are mentioned in the genealogy of our Lord. Jesus born out of that line rather than out of one of these squeaky clean, lily white, nothing ever went wrong, respectable family lines. This is not like but the whole thing, and again, we have, verse 27, we're back to David, Bathsheba has become a she and her again. Not, her name is not given. And then we have this incredible understatement. The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Now, what it says when it says displeased the Lord, that the verb to displease comes from the same root as the word for evil. So you could say he was evil in the sight of the Lord or something like that. So it's a slightly soft translation. Now, what is it that David had done that displeased the Lord? Let's list the whole thing. What had David done?
Well, he lusted after someone's
That was number
wife.
2. What came before that?
Killed someone.
That was number 3. What was before that?
3.
What was the first thing that David
He
did?
was on the couch. He didn't.
He was,
follow
he
follow
was
his
lazy.
armies.
he'd been idle,
Yeah.
not done his job as a king.
Mm.
Then he had given, he had first experience and then given way to lust. He had raped a woman, got her pregnant. Then he tried to lie his way out of it, and when that failed, he decided to murder the person whose existence would expose the truth, and with him, others. And then when the report came to him that these men had died, he tried, oh, never mind, that's all right. These things happen, and it's not a big deal. It was a really big deal. There were lots of mourning households, not just Bathsheba. And he did this to somebody who, all the way through, showed nothing but fastidious care for God's law, observing God's law, and a complete loyalty to David the king, to Israel and armies, and to his colleagues, to his comrades in the army. So this was the thing that David had done. All these things, and it piled up a great big heap of manure that stank in God's eyes. Nobody knew apart from Bathsheba, and it wasn't in her interest to tell anyone. Really well. Because how would she know? She would have to convince the world that that I wasn't a willing participant in this. And it was her word against David. See, this wasn't it. So the only other person who knew the whole thing was Bathsheba. But of course the Lord knows all.
Was David the first king that raped someone?
In the world,
Probably not.
almost no. I mean, you mentioned earlier about Uriah, whether Uriah had other wives. It was in these societies only people of great power and prominent men would have several wives, and it is a feature of many ancient societies, including Israel, that elite men with great power, would take on many wives. It's bad for everybody. It's bad for the wives and their children. For example, child abuse is much more prominent in these households when you have rival wives and their rival children and so on. And that also then left fewer women for anybody else to marry.
Why was that thought to be acceptable, though?
Because you could. It was a sign of power and influence, and if you had lots of wives and lots of offspring.
It was against God's commandment, though, wasn't it?
It was, yes, it was. Yes, I mean, it was just the way of the time.
So Solomon couldn't have been his only son.
Well, by this time David's already got several children by this time.
Well, there'll be men, there'll be more boys, so they weren't chosen.
We'll come to all of that. If you can't wait, read the rest of the book and the beginning of 1 Kings.
I'd rather have it explained in bits.
It's but the point is that was very common. So you have all these men of low status and low influence who couldn't get a wife because there weren't enough women left, which is one explanation for why ancient societies were so violent. Because vast majority of crime, even today, vast majority of violence is committed by young men under the age of 40. And if you are a young man, your body is pumping full of testosterone, which makes you more aggressive. And did you know that getting married lowers your testosterone levels if you're a man?
So they say.
No, it's true. They don't just say it, it's been measured. Yeah. So when men get married, their testosterone level drops, which is why married men tend to be far better behaved than unmarried men. And so one of the reasons, generally speaking, on a population level, the individual, there are very mild-mannered unmarried young men, and there are some terrible married men, but on average. And one reason why the world has become much less violent, and we think of the world as a terrible place, but the world is much less violent than it was, especially the Western world, is because the Christian biblical teaching on marriage finally broke through, and people and kings and princes stopped having lots of wives, and there were enough women to go around, and everybody got married, and then many fewer wars. In the words of one historian I was reading recently, is that like the Vikings, they went all over the world in their long ships. And why was that? So, well, again, they had a polygamous society. I said all these young men who went off on a quest, seeking glory and a girlfriend. Somewhere there aren't any women left at home, so they push out and they post women elsewhere. And what would they go? They come to England and they rape and loot, and those two things went together. And so we see these sorts of things written. We see the moment that God's goodwill gets tampered with, things begin to break down. And we see here in this particular instance, we see how David's moment of lust, that ill-fated walk on the roof, how that begins this network, this kind of seeping permeation of poison throughout, affects everybody. So the cost, an enormous cost to Bathsheba. Not only it begins with the fact that the moment she's purified herself, she's defiled by now, and she loses her purity. Her first pregnancy comes through rape. She loses her husband, and even though people don't know it, she's lost her honor. And I suspect that a few eyebrows must have been raised when Bathsheba was married within 10 days of, also a couple of weeks of her husband's death. So Bathsheba, in a sense, is a marked woman, and she doesn't get a voice until for the rest of this book. We hear Bathsheba speak for the first time in 1 Kings when David's died. So when she is there, you can see that she's, she a young woman. That's her life over, first life over. The cost to Uriah obviously begins with the fact that his wife has been defiled. King wastes time, and then he loses his life, and there's the life of all the other men, all because of that.
That's the only thing is, though, he didn't know that his wife had been defiled.
He
at
didn't.
that point, did he?
No, he didn't know it, but it's nevertheless a reality.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
But he lost his life, and all
Yes.
those other men killed with him, who also lost their lives.
Can I?
And then there's a third thing which I hadn't spotted myself, but I spotted. I was reading a commentary in preparation for this. The author of that commentary has pointed out that there's something else as well. Somebody else is affected, which is Joab. Because Joab is drawn into David's sin, and he's corrupted essentially by David, and now he becomes complicit in it. So not because he chose to do so, he was drafted into this by King David. So this touches everybody involved and others who are not even directly involved. And this is the nature of sin. Sin does it is a poison. It wages war against our souls. And David, and what's it done to David's soul? I mean, what's he turns from this great king into a complete monster, just like that. And it all begins with his dereliction of duty. That lies. I'm really convinced that lies at the very bottom of it. Dereliction of duty. And because he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing, he ends up doing something else. And there's something else. He's not suitably occupied by things given by God, and his sinful flesh begins to throb and draws him into this web of lust, adultery, lies, and ultimately murder. Barbara.
So, what's his name?
Uriah.
Uriah. Are we to believe or to think, in terms of how you've been sort of sorting this as well, is that if he didn't go to bed with his wife, that didn't matter, because if he'd been to war, he would get all the women that they caught in war?
No. Because he wasn't that kind of man, for starters, and he wasn't. He wasn't a war of conquest. They went there to steal women. They also said if David's scheme hadn't worked, if Uriah had survived, he would have come home to a pregnant wife, and he left home when his wife was not pregnant, and so
It would still have caused trouble, wouldn't it? It would still have caused.
He would have caused trouble, and he would have caused.
But
But this time he would have been, Bathsheba. So this is the whole thing. So he left an unpregnant wife and comes home to a pregnant wife, and even if she hadn't been showing, and by the time she gave birth, and hang on, I got home in March, and now it's June and you're giving birth, and so those basically would have been the illicit affair would have been exposed. That's the point.
I guess sort of going back there, that if he wasn't having any with any other women, then how come he is able to? I'm not a man, so I don't know, but he's obviously a young man, and he's going for a long time without being with a woman. So it seems a bit. Why was this? Why was he going to do this? I know you said because it's with the men and everything, but he had an opportunity there, didn't he?
Yes, he did, but he decided to forego his own pleasure, if you like, for the sake of his.
But men don't have to, which is what we've been discussing.
No, I think that's true. I think that's true. That's not true. The world is there are countless men in the world who are completely chaste, and some of them are chaste all their lives. There are plenty of men who never marry and remain chaste throughout their lives. I know that there are some who don't have self-control, but there are plenty who do. It's not unusual, for example, for men to go off and go to the Navy and go off for 9 months, or go to Oman or something, and be gone for a long time, and
Well,
and for the wives to be perfectly confident that, while they're there, they remain chaste.
Well, I never had
who
any
does?
qualms. Rightly or wrongly.
Who does?
I didn't.
Husbands who go to go to the sea or
Yeah, when they go to the sea and it stops, they all get over. And
no, they don't all get over.
No.
well,
They don't. No,
a
no.
good pill do. I mean,
No,
my
no, but we're not
mother
talking.
knows all about this
Well, maybe.
because this is, this is what they used to do.
Yes, I know.
Some
No. Yeah,
might,
but to say
yeah.
that some do doesn't mean that all do.
Well, no.
No.
but
So if you
that's
let's take a subset of men who go to sea, those who are actually God-fearing Christians. What percentage of those men who are God-fearing Christians have faithful wives at home and who want to live their lives by God's law, like Uriah did? How many of those go on shore and run after the nearest red light district? I would have thought that the percentage is very low, and
well, that's
that's what we're talking about. We're talking about Uriah, who's a godly man. We're not talking about men. We're talking about a man.
okay.
And this is but that's the whole point. I mean, the Christian faith isn't just a thing that we hold in our heads. If we have faith in God and our faith is a living faith in God, it makes a difference to it changes our desires. So all people experience temptations, the same temptations. But the difference between an unbeliever and a believer is the believer isn't on his or her own, but we have been given the Holy Spirit who fights with us. So men who are Christians also experience temptation, also matters of sexual desire, but they have the Word of God in their ears and the Holy Spirit in their hearts, and that makes a big difference.
So what happened with David?
Well, that is the thing. That's been the whole point of this Bible study. That he instead of following God's call and exercise his role as a king, he, for reasons that are not explained, decided to stay at home and lie on his couch. That's what happened to him. And of course, I do not allow, or I don't accept that all men are anything, or that all men are like this. I also wouldn't assert that all Christian people are immune from every temptation, never fall. That's not the point either. But it's not at all unlikely that the army of Israel goes to war for 2 months or 3 months, and they come back and they kept their trousers on all the time, and then they go back to the wives. It's completely within the realms of possibility, because they are remotely faithful husbands, if they're remotely God-fearing, you'd expect that. After all, until until they were married, until they had wives, that was pretty much what their life was. That's because we're not talking about the world. We're not talking about the Canaanites here or the Persians. We're talking about the men of Israel. These are God's people, and they have God's law. Taught to them from a young age. They are in the armies of Israel, which the ark of God is their midst. It's like they got. It's a bit like those images you have from the Second World War, for example, or First World War, of padres holding communion service between battles. They have that in their midst all the time, and I think if you just come from the altar of the Lord and then you go to battle, I think that might have an impact on how you behave the next day.
Yes.
If you really believe in that, because if not, I'm afraid there's absolutely no hope for us. Because if the Holy Spirit doesn't give us the fruit, the fruit of His Spirit, which is the fruit of self-control, then I'm afraid we have none of us has any hope. Because of women's temptations and men's temptation might be different, but we are all
still temptation.
So if we go back to David and the fact that he could have any woman he wanted, so to speak, that's kind of, we still think of him as recognizing God.
Yeah, he could, but he shouldn't.
Right.
That's the difference. He could and should. I mean, he could do all. He did all of this. He managed to do it, and nobody ever brought any charges against David. He never got impeached. He never got put in court-martial or anything like that. The only one who rose up against him was God. Yeah, he got away with it, and even after God had punished him, he remained king to the end. It's not about what could; it's about what should, and that is the key. But we have run out of time, so we will stop there. And the story doesn't end; it continues. But this is now the end of the honeymoon.
Mm.
This is when things begin to go wrong in a serious way. And then following several chapters, covering the following several years, is an account of how, if like the period of David's innocence is lost, and he has to now live with the world that he himself has created for himself by his disobedience, by his sin, at the root of which was his abandonment of his God-given vocation. This is why our life and our faith, they are intertwined. You can't say, well, I have my faith, but it doesn't impact my life. We have to be really, really serious about what God has called us to do in our daily lives as well. And if we find ourselves idle, well, we can't think of anything else, ask somebody else. How can it be useful so that we're not tempted? And let's close with prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you instruct us through your word, and not only by the proclamations of your prophets and by the example of your saints, but also by the sins and failures of those whose lives are recorded in the scriptures. And we pray that your Holy Spirit would work in our lives to warn us against temptation and sin, give us strength when we are tempted, keep our eyes always fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And when we do fail, when we do fall, that we would not despair of your mercy or become hardened again, but would in repentance turn away from sin and turn back to you, especially to your Son Jesus Christ, in whom we have redemption and forgiveness of sins. Strengthen your church in his witness to your goodness in this world that is so lost in darkness and sin. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.
Amen.